Okay, so now for the fun part. I am excited to welcome Marc Cameron. Welcome to Jacksonville. How'd you get here so fast? Marc is a retired Chief Deputy U.S. Marshal and New York Times bestselling author of the Jericho Quinn Thriller Series, which debuted in 2011. Since then, he's written 8 Quinn novels and 4 Arliss Cutter novels featuring a Deputy U.S. Marshal based in Alaska, including the most recent addition to the series, Cold Snap. Marc is the author of 5 Tom Clancy Jack Ryan novels for the Tom Clancy estate, including the most recent Chain of Command. He is an avid outdoorsman, sailor, and adventure motorcyclist, and currently lives in Alaska with his wife. Marc will be joined in conversation with local author Michael Wiley. His most recent novel is Head Case, the 3rd book in a series featuring the deeply disinhibited Chicago PI Sam Kelson. He is the author of the Seamus Award-winning Monument Road, about an exonerated death row inmate investigating the crime that sent him to prison, and writes the Daniel Turner Thriller Series and the Seamus Award-winning Joe Kosmarski Private Detective Series. He is a frequent book reviewer and an occasional writer of journalism, critical books, and essays. He teaches literature at the University of North Florida and lives here in beautiful Jacksonville. Michael, I'm going to leave the rest to you.
Thank you, Amani, and thank you to Allison for arranging this. Marc Cameron and I know each other very little, but we've seen each other on the road on occasion, and we've actually done a panel in the past in Dallas in 2019. I had to look that up. It was it was called Writing Action and Violence, and as you can tell from those biographies, those brief biographies, Marc really has, he's got the credentials to do this kind of work. Along with Marc on this panel, we also had a former military general, we had a fighter pilot, we had a DE agent, and then we had a couple of people who have stronger backgrounds in academics than say, the real world. There was me, and then there was a guy who had an MFA in creative writing. And so it was a really interesting kind of a combination. So I'd like to start with biographical in some ways. And so I'm curious, Marc, how central is your law enforcement background to the writing you do? How crucial is it to have that in terms of developing your characters? I'm thinking especially like Arliss Cutter in Cold Snap, but in general, how much has that been instrumental to your writing?
I think it's really central to it. I don't ever, or I shouldn't say ever, I rarely base a character on any one person I know, but these characters are certainly inspired by people that I've worked with, people I've arrested, bad guys I've hunted, my own experiences. Many of the fights, the actual, I think we even talked about this on our panel. Many of the fights are, I believe fights are dialogue. Fights are just a way that 2 humans communicate, and it's just not with words, it's with physical actions. And so when you're in this kind of job, then oftentimes you learn that kind of communication, you learn that language. And so that's what I hope to come across. What I want to do is write characters that are, 3-dimensional characters, whether they're law enforcement or not, or bad guys or not, and then be able to write with some verisimilitude about the place where Alaska, where I put them, where I live, and then what it's like to carry a gun all day, every day, what it's like to have your children in law enforcement, or be a child of someone in law enforcement. And so those sorts of things, if I'm doing it like I hope I'm doing it, then that becomes central to the story.
Right. 2 things. One is, fights are dialogue, and as comes really clear through your handling of dialogue, which is a tricky kind of a thing for all writers. Dialogues can also be fights, right?
That's true.
Every dialogue of any kind has you don't want to say a winner and a loser, but there's something exchanged, right?
Some jousting.
Something,
Yeah.
something, and so how crucial is the dialogue part of it to you? It seems to me that you write that really crisply.
Well, I appreciate that. I think when I'm talking to newer writers, I always try to point out, or to remind them that dialogue in a book and really in a movie, dialogue is the suggestion of conversation. It's not what we really speak like. Oftentimes, I'm fortunate that I'm married to a retired English teacher and social studies teacher, so she reads and red pens everything that I write. And when I write a bit of dialogue that may be a bit plotting, instead of circling it with a red pen, she'll say something like, she'll look down over the top of the paper and she'll say, "Do you like my hat?" "Yes, I like your hat." "Hello, goodbye, goodbye, goodbye." And sort of give me that Dr. Seuss, like, "Oh, you need to pare this down," sort of a nod. And I think fights are the same way, whether any communication in a book. What I try to stay away from is, like, you see this trope in screenwriting sometimes, the "as you know" kind of a thing, where you try to spoon feed your reader by me telling you, "Well, as you know, Michael, the such and such, electric fantabulator, blah, 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 that they need to know about." I try to do that a little different way and give my reader some credit. So
Right.
hopefully that makes things crisper in a fight or in a spoken dialogue.
Right. Yeah. Dialogue is transaction. And as you're suggesting, it's also action. And if action doesn't take place through that dialogue, it becomes really clear real fast. We're sitting around doing this, or we're filling in information that the readers should already know, which takes maybe us back a little bit to that question of verisimilitude of the law enforcement, where one of the things that you do very nicely is you provide the sense of the verisimilitude, the sense of the tools, the kinds of behaviors, the ways that people in law enforcement are going to be working as part of the action and as part of the dialogue, in ways that are not saying, "All right, now we're going to stop the action and explain." I'm curious, how closely, you're living in Alaska. I know that you've done work all over the United States, and I believe beyond the United States as well.
Some, yes.
Mexico, at least. How close does that align with the day-to-day realities of the work that you did for 30 years? Is it
Well, it's certainly
transactional?
compressed. Yeah, it's certainly compressed. I always used to joke that, one of the main jobs of the Marshal Service of Deputy U.S. Marshals, especially when you're brand new, is to bring violent prisoners back and forth to court. And so as new deputies, we call them baby deputies. When you're a baby deputy, you sit in court a lot. And depending on the district you're in, I was fortunate. I had law enforcement experience coming on. So I went to these small 2-person offices that were not very court heavy. I was in East Texas for a time, which is actually north of Dallas, but it was part of the Eastern District. And we spent I was there 4 years. The better part of the first 2.5 years, it was just out hunting fugitives all day, every day. And then the cocaine laws changed and some things changed, and we got this waterfall, this tidal wave of prisoners, and it was just a lot of sitting in court. I remember one particular time that, thinking about it or telling a story, it comes across okay, but writing in a book, it was a white collar crime case, had to do with a lot of stolen vehicles and laundering money. And because a lot of it was on tape, like caught by a third party, like a FBI informant wearing a wire, they had to wear headphones. So the jury wore headphones, the defendant wore headphones, the judge wore headphones. Everyone involved in the trial wore headphones except the 2 deputy marshals for days. And so the whole trial we were sitting there in complete silence, just sort of looking at each other, watching and the prisoners were bad guys. I say white collar, but they'd whacked some people as well. I can't put that in a book. That's like the most boring thing. It was interesting to note that that's how boring Marshal Service could be. So if I wrote without compressing, putting all the exciting stuff, all the stuff I write about in the Cutter books can and does happen. It's compressed such that I can put it in a 400-page book, and it wouldn't be a novel about, some deputy marshal sleeping with a big drool spot on his tie in court, so that's what I work for.
No, it's I think that comes across. In a few minutes, I'd like to turn to conversation about plotting, because you work plot in a very interesting way, and a way without giving spoilers. And I want to raise some questions about and
Sure.
and admire, because there are certain ways of building tension and suspense that are very tricky to do for those of us who haven't tried. And when it's done well, the satisfactions are great. Let's move a little bit, though, if we could, first of all, to Cold Snap and the current character that you have, Arliss Cutter, who's this wonderfully tough, smart, sometimes very grouchy kind of a protagonist who does a lot of interesting kinds of things. He's willing to take some physical, emotional, psychological beatings along the way to a path of, on the path to justice, as some of our favorite, characters are. Can you tell us? I'm imagining that some of us who are listening now have read some of the Arliss Cutter books. This is his fourth outing, and I'm guessing that a good number of people here, will be new to him. Can you tell us a little bit more about Arliss?
Yeah, so the easiest way to describe Arliss is he is, and is considered by all those that know him, kind of the patron saint of underdogs. Something happened to him that, if you read the second book, you'll find out what happened in his past, but something really awful happened to him where he feels like he did not take the action he needed to take. Someone got hurt. He wasn't able to step in. He can't forgive himself for that. And because of that, since the time that he was in the military, he's just made it his life mission to always act in other people's best interests. Basically, to never let bad behavior go unanswered, whether it's somebody being rude to the elderly woman in the shopping line, or somebody being, somebody teasing someone in the swimming pool. If it's more than just real teasing, he just will not accept that. And so because of that, and of course, then you ramp it up a little bit into the law enforcement community, and he will not accept bad behavior at all. And so although he's not it's something that we go back and forth with his partner, sidekick, she's strong in her own right, Lola Ariki, his younger partner, kind of his foil sometimes. She's like, why did you smack the guy in the head with a metal pipe? And he's like, well, I could have shot him. So it's not like I'm beating the guy to death just to beat him. He doesn't beat people to death. I don't want you to think that's that kind of book. But in one of the early books, the very first book, he ends up hooking a guy in the hand with a Halligan tool and pulling him into a punch when that guy's trying to beat someone to death, another deputy. And it just looks so brutal. But Cutter's like, oh, I could have shot him, and I didn't shoot him, but I'm not going to put up with that kind of behavior either. So Arliss is that kind of guy. Probably the two things that describe him the best are that, and then the fact that he's always been in love with his widowed sister-in-law. He met her first. His brother swooped in, the older, kind of more suave brother swooped in and got her. And so Arliss has had, since he was 16, he's had this kind of unrequited love for the woman that ended up being his sister-in-law. So he's not very lucky in that regard. He's been married 4 times, and now his brother has passed away. He's come up to take care of his sister-in-law's family and their kids, and so he basically becomes a a pseudo father, a handyman, a honeydew, a chef he likes to cook, but not a husband, which is what he really wants to be. So there's that romance side of it, or unrequited romance side of things as well.
Right. What strikes me about him is he's fresh. We haven't seen Arliss Cutter in other fiction before, and at the same time, as you describe him, he's one of my favorite kinds of heroes in crime fiction and thrillers and in mysteries. He's in some senses an underdog. He's a very strong underdog for an underdog, but he's been battered. He's been battered, and he's not only is he an underdog in terms of the overall life circumstances, but he's fighting against the odds, kind of moment by moment, and those odds again we'll want to get to in a few in terms of environmental, other kinds of people, as well as his own background. The brother-in-law, we won't get into him, right? I'm sorry, his brother, we won't get into right now, but for those of us who haven't read the book, you're in for some pleasures, for I think ones that are suggesting future stories as well, involving an important figure here. Again, a fresh character, a person who's a tracker, a person who has the outdoors kind of capabilities, a person who has always this kind of moral compass that, if the institutional law points due north this way, if he realizes that justice is actually over here, his needle is going to swing that direction. Again, the kind of character we love. Are there any characters you've read, ones that maybe, some of the people who are listening now might also recognize, who you would say, all right, this helped me to think about why this character, or favorites of yours, people who you would maybe say, all right, my guy is my guy, but these other characters have been important to me as a writer.
Right off the bat, I can think of Travis McGee. I was a big Travis McGee fan. I mean, the poor guy, he got to live on a boat. He got to save beautiful women all the time, but he hardly ever got a leg up. He was like Jim Rockford, in the old Rockford Files. He was always doing the right thing, but never quite getting the reward,
So everybody has to read the McDonald novels too.
Yeah, well, and they well should. Those are every writer and every reader should read those, and they don't take long. They're Lou L'Amour sized books, but and honestly, I modeled Arliss a lot after men and women that I've worked with over the years as well, and my own sons and my daughter. But my sons always joke with each other that they have a Tarzan complex. The oldest one's a physician. He was an Air Force OSI agent like Jericho Quinn for a number of years, and a boxer and all of that. But my youngest is a SWAT officer with the local police department in Anchorage. And they always joke that they have, both of them have kind of pronounced foreheads and protruding jaws, and like to swing in, freakishly long arms, and like to swing in and save the underdog now and again. And that's the kind of person that I wanted Arliss to be, is that have a bit of a Tarzan complex, which can get him in trouble, both because not everybody wants to be saved, and people can be a bit put off by a big strong man saying, I'm here to save the day, kind of a thing.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting kind of genesis for your characters, is that your adult character, kind of part of his personality has to do with the grumpiness, the grouchiness, kind of the toughness, he's not the guy who's going to immediately, give the big broad smile and the comforting hand, but clearly that warmth is inside him. And it's intriguing to me that this grows out in part out of your kids, right? So your sons become almost kind of like the father figure for all of these other kinds of characters. Do you typically, you were talking about before how you've known people and you work with these kinds of people in your fiction. Do you take an individual and say, all right, this is the individual? and I'm going to write a character who has something to do with, who has certain kind of characteristics there? Or do you combine characters? I think that, or, people we know, I know that a lot of us do that. Say, I know this one person who does this other person who does that, and a third person who does this. What if we put these traits together? Because they're consistent. I mean, what's your process in?
Oh yeah, yeah, a little of both, but a lot more of the latter, with the exception of Arliss's nephews. Those are my grandsons. The way they speak. My grandsons aren't twins like they are in the books, but the way they speak. I'm fortunate that when I write about 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old kids, that I have them to listen to when we go visit them, because they have a different vernacular, and I'm 60 years old. I don't have that vernacular, but I get to hear my grandchildren and the way they speak, the way they argue but love each other. And so when I envision Arliss and his brother, when I envision Matthew and Michael, they're very closely based on my grandsons. And the Constance character is based more on my daughter when she was in a rough patch growing up, but she's not like that anymore. She's happily married and very sweet and all that, but she's kind of prickly in the books.
Yeah. Well, here's a kind of a tricky one. And I'm not going to name the name of the writer whom I'm thinking of. And I've faced this myself as well. There's a writer I know who has a character actually named after his biological daughter, his real daughter. And in one of the books, this writer puts the daughter in a situation of extreme danger, extreme abuse. Are there times when you have flinched, and that's a word that I think is an interesting to me in relationship to your writing. Are there times when you've flinched, saying, all right, this is too much of my kid. I can't do this to him. I can't do this. Or are they two separate things?
I don't. I'm not one of those writers that they're inspired by my grandkids, I should say, and the quirks and everything. But if I put them in jeopardy, it's not my grandkids.
It's not the grandkids.
Yeah. Or by the same token, every woman in my books is my wife to one degree or another. I mean,
I was going to ask about Lola. Lola again, you can tell us about Lola, but she's a fun character, cool character, strong character.
Very strong. My wife and I, pre-COVID, went to the South Pacific, to the island of Rarotonga for a couple of months, 2 or 3 months every year for 7 years.
Wow.
And I did a lot of the first Clancy books were written, at least the bones of them were fleshed out there. And, getting to know the Cook Island Maori people and just the happy but strong and very vibrant culture. I just wanted to write a character that had that kind of a culture, and they speak with a New Zealand, a Kiwi accent. And so Lola is that kind of she's based on 4 or 5 women that I know, plus my wife. Like I say, my wife is every villainous woman, every mim, she's the person I know best. And so I take little bits and pieces and bits of vocabulary and use her, like, oh, if Vicky was evil, this is what she would be like.
And I think that's a fascinating way of thinking about it too. Is sometimes we get comic book characters in thrillers and mysteries and other kinds of places, and we say, this might be an enjoyable read, but they don't, the characters don't feel real. But what you're talking about doing, and it seems to me, very, very effective in your books, and something that I think that readers tend to appreciate, is, real people, right? Real people have experienced fear, have experienced courage, have experienced sadness. Now, what if we put them in a narrative where all of these things are tied together in a kind of a single type of a thing? They're responding the way that probably the people we would respond, or the people we know would. Yeah,
absolutely.
Nice.
That makes it fun.
Any comments on the name Arliss? Why Arliss Cutter? Arliss is a good Irish name.
Not really. I wanted it to be. We actually went back and forth a bit with a publisher. They wanted it to be a stronger name. I wanted it to be not strong. I wanted it to be the opposite. I wanted it to be something that could. I mean, there's a couple of ladies here in Alaska that are named Arliss. It's a either gender name.
It's a boy named Sue.
Yeah, exactly. So I really wanted it to be something that was Southern, and Arliss, I got it from Old Yeller. I mean, he's the little
Right.
Arliss is Old Yeller.
I was wondering if that was the connection.
Yeah, and actually there's a bit of dialogue in the third book, I think, where he's working with a reporter, and anyway, she's got a name that's connected to Kill a Mockingbird, and she points out his name, so they sort of joust back and forth there. But
Right.
no, like I say, I won the battle, but it was
an important one.
There was a bit of a pushback, like maybe Ethan should be his name and Arliss should be the dead brother.
Or you could have just called him Rock.
Yeah,
Rock
exactly.
Cutter.
Yeah,
Right? No, I mean,
yeah.
no. I mean,
that's funny you say that, because I was doing research for one of the first Jack Ryan novels that I wrote, and I went out with a Coast Guard, and the two people showing me around were Commander Rock, and the other one was Lieutenant Commander War, WARR. And I said,
names are destiny.
Yeah, and I said, I like to name some characters after you guys in the book, but my editor would say no, that there's no way that anyone would believe those are real names in this kind of book.
Right. No, that's wonderful. Yeah, it was, I looked up the name, again, because I wanted to see, and I guess in Irish it means pledge, so pledge Cutter, and there is something that works for that, and there's a kind of a pledge that he's always pursuing. Not that had anything to do with the name, the name choice. I think sometimes we say, all right, this sounds right to my ear, and it's complicated. It doesn't make him a cartoon.
Well, and in writing too, as a writer yourself, that most of the time our way of doing things is to call people by their last names.
Right.
And so it allows me, with a name like Arliss Cutter, it allows me through most of the book, he's Cutter. And then when I want a tender moment, Mim, or when Lola wants to get through to him, she can say, listen, Arliss. And then it becomes a whole different mood on the page. By just switching the names. Very
nice. And in terms of practicality, readers aren't saying, who the heck is Arliss? They remember, right? Because it's a distinctive name. It's not saying Bill, and then we think Bill, haven't seen Bill. Let me switch up a little bit. Just looking at the amount of time that we have, I do want to talk about plot, because this is a really a powerful plot. But you mentioned the Southern to the name Arliss, and of interest maybe to people here is that Arliss has of course that foot deeply in the snow in Alaska, but also has a foot in Florida, Port Charlotte, but beyond that, again, can you those two poles are fascinating.
Well, that is a good reason for it, is because they are so different and yet both so wild. I mean, even though you have Miami and Pensacola, and you have big cities, you also have miles and miles and miles of glades and backcountry there, where we have what we call the bush, Alaska, with no roads. Same with Florida, where you have to get a boat to get into certain places. And so he grew up, a little background on him, he was orphaned, basically. His mother is somewhere out there, she's still alive, but abandoned him as a young child, and his father died. And so he and his brother were raised by their grandfather, who everybody called Grumpy, because Arliss couldn't say grandpa as a child. And so Grumpy just sort of stuck, because a lot like Arliss, he doesn't smile very much. And Grumpy was a Florida Marine Patrol officer. After Hurricane Andrew, back in, what was that, 92? I was sent 91 or 92. About 300 of us deputy marshals were sent to Florida for basically the aftermath of Hurricane Andrew. So helping out with local law enforcement and whatnot. I was there for not quite 6 weeks. So I worked with FDLE, with the Marine Patrol, Fort Lauderdale, and then Homestead Police, and we took the place of Homestead PD because their homes were destroyed as well. And so I got to get to know some of those law enforcement officers quite well there, and kept in touch with them over the years. And so it was easy for me then, and this has little to do with the plot, but my barber owns a house in Port Charlotte and she lets us stay there. So we
Perfect.
went and did some research there, liked the area, and it was a good place to put him. Also, I went to Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, which is just north of you guys, in Brunswick, Georgia. So
Yep.
I flew in and out of Jacksonville a lot as a deputy marshal. So I knew the area a bit, and it was a nice place to put him as a country boy, but with an understanding of the city, so that it's not out of his character to know that he knows how to track. He knows how to track game. He knows how to be out in the woods. But he can be a fish out of the water because, oh my goodness, I came from Texas and then a short stint in Idaho, but then plunked down in the middle of Bush, Alaska, where there's bears as big as Volkswagens. And, it was a kind of a fish out of water story for me too. So I've been able to use that portion of Arliss's background to make it more interesting, as Lola, who, even though she's Cook Island, Polynesian descent, she's been here longer in Alaska. So she can teach Arliss little things he can teach her tracking, but she can teach him about what it's like in Bush, Alaska.
Right. So we have, the South, the North. We have Arliss, the soft name, and Cutter, the cut name. We have the kind of the powerful goodness inside him and the kind of gruff exterior. And so all of these features, contribute both to the character and the setting and the overall feel of it, which finally brings me to the plot. Because these are also plot elements, right? I mean, Florida is a tug. Florida is, it's not a big part, say, in Cold Snap, but it's a question, and it's a question that's unresolved.
Well, we have the backstory. We have the backstory with their little boys.
Right. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about plot, because it's one of the things that, of course, we know is when all the elements are against us, the crisis rises, and without any spoilers, all the elements are against Arliss and his crew. That's not a surprise in reading a thriller. I don't want to go into too much detail, but we're in a rough country. We're in Alaska, so there's environmental, there's the bad guys, there's also the internal weaknesses of whatever the circumstances are. We won't get into the details of what's going on in that, but kind of where you're fighting with an arm tied behind your back, kind of a situation. Again, this might be too general of a question, but thoughts on plot?
Well, I mean, I think it's not giving away too much to say that he's, on the flap copy, he's stranded out in the bush with a bunch of prisoners.
Right.
In this particular book, you've got two storylines that converge: a serial killer investigation that Lola's kind of not heading up, but assisting the locals with, that actually dovetails on from the last book. I always believe people get grouchy because I leave cliffhangers, but life is a cliffhanger. And I never, as an investigator, never cleared my desk. I would clear a case or arrest a fugitive or whatever, but there'd always be 10, 20, 30 more percolating over, working your way down the stack, so to speak. And so that's what Arliss does. So this serial killer case, which isn't a deputy marshal swim lane anyway, but it becomes so, which honestly, it happens up here in Alaska, where we are the only people to back up the trooper. And so we end up helping out. So that's going on. And then Arliss ends up in the woods with some pretty bad felons dealing with a bad storm in the spring and snow and wildlife and all kinds of things. So it's not hard to come up with, rocks to throw at my protagonists, because Alaska is such a place that I mean, my wife raises bees, and I woke up 2 nights ago with her like running out on the back deck with her robe on, cursing out a bear that was trying to get into her beehives, and I physically had to restrain her from running out there and smacking the bear. And then I went out while she suited up. This is 11 o'clock at night, suited up in her bee suit. She has very strong, like plastic hives that she uses that are a little more indestructible than wooden hives. But I had to go out there with my gun and guard her while I couldn't put a bee suit on, because then it would impede my view. And so she's out there muscling these big, heavy, honey-filled hives while I'm guarding her. So those sorts of things happen all the time. So giving Arliss a bear or wolves or a plane crash or a
all of the above
storm or all the above is not out of the ordinary at all. And I don't have to reach too far into my quiver of arrows to find a lot of stuff to shoot at him.
Yeah, if all that happened in New York City, you don't believe the wolf and the bear, but in Alaska, it works. You were talking about the bad guys, and they are really, really, really bad guys. And Arliss is, Arliss and Lola and kind of their crew, they need to stop them, and that involves some pretty good fights, to go back to that term. You are not, I wouldn't describe the major kind of impulse of this book at all as being violent, but violence is part of the world in which they live. Alaska is, it kind of strips to the skin and then frostbites it. Are there kinds of violence? Are there kinds of actions that Arliss would never go to that level? Are there kinds of violence that you as a writer say, yeah, but I wouldn't do this? And I want to do one other. This is not a spoiler, but a kind of a part of this book includes a whole shipload of very, very cute puppies. Which some writers say, well, I would never hurt a pet. But are there lines?
Well, I get emails all the time about another book I did where a dog did die.
Yeah,
a police dog. In fact, the book is dedicated to a real police dog that was involved in an incident with my youngest son, and probably saved my son from, definitely saved my son from getting badly injured, and maybe even, worse than that. So, I love dogs, I love animals, but they're characters in the books, and I'm not going to stop. If it's germane to the story, I wouldn't kill a dog, or I wouldn't have a woman sexually assaulted or even someone killed just to jazz up the story. It has to be part of the real plot, part of what they would actually do, part of what the bad guys would actually do. Because not all bad guys are killers. They can be super bad, but would kill out of fear. I always tell people all the time, most of the fights I was ever in were people trying to get away from me, not turning to say, I'm going to kill you.
Right. We had that conversation in Dallas. Yeah.
There were some like that, but honestly, I try not to turn away from too much.
You have some funny stories about some of those fights.
Yeah.
Yeah, too. It's it's a tricky kind of thing, because as to your point, readers very often are going to be more upset about, say, the killing of a police dog that has been trained and is part of this, this life, far more upset about that than
Right.
seeing, people die.
Right.
Yeah. Well, one final question before we turn to the audience questions from me. Grumpy Cutter's oatmeal energy cookies. We get a recipe. We get a recipe here. We get a recipe. Again, that's not a spoiler. That's an enticement. We get an enticement. So
Yeah.
I think it's interesting, because this isn't the kind of book that often one would get the. Again, there's a recipe in the back, and I'm
Right.
going to cook these cookies, before
Very
the day
awesome.
is done. Just any thoughts on putting that recipe into the book?
Yeah. So the very first book, Open Carry, it doesn't have a recipe in the back, but it's got a step-by-step how Cutter makes scrambled eggs for basically he's teaching his nephews how to cook. And so the nice side of him gets to come out. And I get so many emails about Arliss Cutter's or Grumpy Cutter's scrambled eggs because he attributes them to his grandfather. And so I thought, well, let's just start putting recipes in. So we, whenever there's a cooking scene, a couple in each, they got to eat. And there's some sort of cooking scene in the book. So the second book has, I think, I can't even remember. One of them has beef stew and biscuits, and the second book has cowboy chili pie, which I first had with moose out in the middle of up on the Yukon River that a trooper's wife fixed for me in real life. So cowboy chili pie's in there. I get people to send me photos of their cowboy chili pie. Send me photos of their someday we'll do a recipe book. I don't know.
So the Arliss Cutter books, come for the entertainment and leave with a full stomach.
That's right. That's right.
It's a good deal. Well, let me raise some questions from people who are with us here. This is from, and I apologize if I mispronounce names. Joan, I think it's Sosin. She asks, do you write using a strict outline? You have a tremendous background for your books, but do you do extensive research for any of your books? Well, let's do one of these at a time. Do you write using a strict outline?
I do. In fact, Nick Petrie, who is on our panel together, he's what we call a pantser. He says he writes from the seat of the pants. And I don't know, I can't remember whether you're a plotter or a pantser.
I'm a mix. I want to know where the book is going and where it comes from, and I want some of the middle. But yeah, go ahead.
I have to do that as well. I am I accuse Nick of being, who's a brilliant writer, by the way. You should read
Wonderful writer. If you haven't read him, Petrie.
Yeah, spelled Petrie, said Petrie.
Petrie, yeah, like Dick Petrie, but
right,
Petrie.
Right, said Petrie, right. Good, and a good dude too.
Good guy.
I always accuse him of lying and saying that, and basically he's just super smart and he plots it all out in his head and doesn't need it written. I have to have it written, so I might go through. I'm starting a new book, so now I've just got the first couple of pages, but I might go through 5 of these pages, these Rhoda pads before and a bunch of Blackwing pencils before I get to where I want to start, once upon a time. So I'll research and free write and plot. And then what I do, and it's worked well for me for 26 novels, I will actually take my outline and go down scene by scene and put that in my computer. I write it out, usually longhand, put that out in my computer, and then I just flesh out those scenes. Now, I'm not married to them, and I'll move them around. I might cut one, I might add one, but I definitely spend a lot of time plotting. My brain just needs it. I'll forget as I go along.
That sounds very similar to me. That you're maybe a little bit more plotting than I do, but my sense from this is a pretty frequently asked question, and it seems to me that most of us who are writing in the crime fiction genre are somewhere in that space of wanting to know enough but not feeling beholden to it, because I
have to know, like you said, you have to know where the book's going. I have to know the end before I can really write the bending, and that doesn't mean that I know the end words. I mean, I oftentimes I tell newer writers this all the time. Often the very first sentence of the first chapter doesn't happen until you've written 3 chapters, and you can put those off in another file. They're not wasted. Put them off in another file somewhere. Now the book begins, and
That's
then
right.
I know how the book ends, but I generally like to end the book with some sort of resonance, and that particular one actually resonates. That last line even resonates, and I don't know that until I've written it. So I know how the book ends, but I don't know really. So there's still discovery there for me, which makes it fun.
That's nice. Yeah. You're saying leaving books with cliffhangers. I should say, for those people who haven't read your books, the major questions get resolved. And there is that feeling of resonance. The language makes us feel, all right, we've reached a point, we know we've reached the end, but there are ongoing stories that we want to read for the future. Nice. You know who, again, I've always been suspicious of when he says that he writes the first sentence without knowing the second, is Lee Child. Says similarly,
brilliant.
and
He's so brilliant.
all the power, all the power.
Yeah,
My brain
yeah.
is too small.
They're just smarter.
Yeah. Here's the next one. You have a tremendous background for your books, but do you do extensive research for any of your books? If so, can you give an example of the kind of research you do?
I talk to smart people. I go to the places. COVID sort of shut me down a little bit, but my wife and I have traveled numerous times to Japan and Argentina, and we took a trip down the Alcan. When I wrote the Jericho books, I rode all over on like that yellow motorcycle there, all over the country. I've done the Alcan 7 times, 3 times in a car and 4 times on my motorcycle, just to get the feel of the bike, and it's enjoyable. And just the other day, I was interviewing a F-117 stealth pilot for the next Clancy. That stuff was so top secret, we didn't even get to know about it. The time that the book is set in 1985. So got to find out, and just tremendous people. The military sent me on a thing called Joint Civilian Orientation Conference, where we got to go out and ride in Ospreys. We got to ride in helicopters and get on, carriers, and, just and talk to members of the military. The research for me, there's always, when you go in to do research, and Michael, you know this, when you go in to do research, there's the known unknowns. You go in and say, I need to answer, I've got this list of questions that I want to ask you. But the gold, the gems that you find are the unknown unknowns you had no idea to even ask. And those are the ones that I usually try to put in the book.
Yeah, and sometimes you see them, sometimes you hear them.
Oh, yeah,
exactly. So I think you're already pointing pretty strongly toward an answer, but just to clarify, we were talking about before about writing from the seat of the pants, not knowing where we're going, versus outlining. There's also writing what you know versus say learning what you need to know through all the research. Where do you put yourself on that spectrum?
No, I do, and I have a different mantra. My mantra is don't write what you do not know. So in other words, if I were to try to write about an F-117 stealth aircraft and make it all up because it was secret, then I wouldn't, or get into the pilot's head, or if I were to try to write about the Marshal service without doing some, living 22 years in it, or let's say the CIA. I have a friend that's retired CIA. Because that's so secret, I can write about stuff, and CIA is not going to come back and question me. But by talking to this guy or these people, I'm able to add some, so that the layman will look at it and go, oh, that sounds real. And then also other operators can look at it and go, oh, wow, I wonder how I found that
real
out.
enough.
So,
right.
But if you write about somebody or something without doing your due diligence, believe me, you will hear from here. I got an email years ago from a nuclear physicist in Idaho or Washington, wherever Hanford is. I think that's Washington. And he's very nice. He said, I like this book. It was one of the Jericho books, but you got the half-life of plutonium, whatever, off by 35,000 years. And I was like, dude, I'm just so happy you read that a nuclear physicist is reading a Jericho Quinn book. So yeah, right. people read and they will definitely catch you.
Yeah, anybody who has been writing these kinds of books for a little while is going to get those emails or messages one way or another. And very often, and this is one of the areas where I'm guessing that you do not get those messages, because I'm guessing that you know the field very well, but very often the area has to do with guns. A lot of writers misrepresent guns. And so what I'm hearing you say, though, is that you find out what don't write what you don't know, which means learn to know it, find out what you need to know.
Yeah. In other words, you don't have to be a deputy marshal to write about the marshal service, but talk to a deputy marshal, talk to a police officer that's worked with him, go out and shoot a gun. I happen to, my son's a SWAT officer, so I can go out and shoot full automatics and suppressors and stuff that we own together and that I've had since I was a young police officer. So I only write about weapons that I've actually handled and shot. I just happen to have been able to handle, not counting, Stinger missiles and Laws rockets and stuff like that. But I've been fortunate to be able to shoot a lot of different kinds of weapons and be involved in a lot of different kinds of martial arts and boxing and whatnot. So I'm able to draw from that or talk to people that, I called my son for the last Clancy and said, hey, I've got this guy shooting from this far away, this kind of an angle. And my son, who's never really a big math person in school, was like, well, this is what you need. And he's like quoting trigonometry to me. I'm like, man, you did great at weaponizing your math when you
it was 30. Like, you didn't need the school trigonometry, but now you need it because it's life and death. One of what you're reiterating, and again, it's something that I think that we hear time and time again. People who are really at the top of this field, people who are really doing this work well, there aren't the shortcuts. This is imaginative writing, this is creative writing, this is fiction, and for the fiction to work, it means that there's it's the good, pleasurable, but it's the good hard work of doing the research too, right?
Right.
Nice.
Absolutely.
We have a question, and I think it's from Rajiv Sanyal. And it's a question about how you published your first book, kind of a curiosity about your origin story.
So I ghost wrote, I actually met an agent or a publisher at a Western Writers Convention in Helena, Montana. And I did our little pitch thing. So I would do my little pitch, 5 minutes, here's what my book's about. And she said, yeah, send me 3 chapters. I sent her 3 chapters, didn't hear from her for a while. And finally, actually on the day that we found out my father-in-law was passing away, he was 90 at the time. My wife called me at work and said, my dad is dying. And I love the guy. He was one of my heroes. She said, my dad is dying and Kensington Publishing called and they want to publish your book. And I'm like, oh, wow, I can't be happy. I can't be sad. So we went.
And that was the day that your hair fell out.
Exactly.
Yeah, mine too.
So we went to Calgary. We were able to connect with my father-in-law, who's, he was 50 when my wife was born. So a lot older than her. We knew he was going to pass away early in our lives. Anyway, got to chat with him a bit. He passed peacefully, heroically. Then I got with Kensington and the lady said, I can't do yours right now. I can't slot it, but I really need these books finished, or this book finished for another writer, an existing writer. Could you ghost it? And then I can sort of go into editorial and say, this is how this guy writes because I like your chapters. And so I said, sure, absolutely. So she FedExed the stuff to Calgary while we were there. I read them over, said, this is great. I called back Kensington and I said, hey, I need to speak to so-and-so. I'm supposed to be ghostwriting. They said, she doesn't work here anymore. And I said, what? And they said, no, she's moved on. She's not working here anymore. And I said, well, I'm supposed to be doing this and this. And they said, that's between you and her. Sorry, goodbye. And I hung up. And so I thought, well, I'm so excited and I'm orphaned. And then the next day,
before you were even born, right?
I got an email from an agent with Writer's House named Robin Rue, who's been my agent now for 19 years. And she said, so-and-so gave me your chapters. I want to represent you. And then we went on from there.
That's wonderful. And you ended up, and again, the other punchline is you're publishing with Kensington.
Yeah, and Kensington actually, I did 2 ghostwritten books for them where my name doesn't appear on the cover. They made the USA Today list, but I didn't get anything from it except kudos from the publisher. Then they did 2 Westerns for me under the name Mark Henry, Mark with a K, Henry. That was my fictitious ID name when I was with the Marshal Service, so I had a driver's license with that name.
Great.
And then my publisher called, or my agent Robin called one day and said, you really want to write contemporary thrillers? Why don't you try one? And I wrote 2, and neither of them got published. In fact, one of them I got a really nice page-and-a-half rejection letter from one of the big 5, and they said, we love your writing, we love the way you put words together, but this is not commercial, because, to boil it all down, who cares about Alaska and who cares about these Alaska Native kids you have in here? And I was mad. I was super mad.
For good reason. For good reason.
And this was back in 2003 or 4, something like that. And they said, you need to write something over the top. You need to write Jason Bourne, James Bond. And so I created what I thought was going to be a one-off character, which was a OSI agent that's an Air Force Academy boxer that rides a motorcycle and carries a killing sword behind his back, and speaks 7 languages, and has a giant Marine gunnery sergeant for a sidekick, and a beautiful Cuban Russian girlfriend. And that's Jericho Quinn, and we've sold 10 novels. So I was able to, and actually the first Arliss Cutter is essentially the book that I got the rejection letter on.
Right. So you showed them, but the story that you tell, I think is a really instructive one for anybody who is writing that first manuscript, or the second, or the third, or the fifth, and not finding a place, which is, twofold. One is that the routes in and around are as varied as there are members of the writing community. And 2, you can have it made, you've got the editor who's all excited, and then she disappears. And anybody who's been doing this for a while has the editor who's left, or been fired, or changed career directions, or whatever else. All of these things are part of the day-to-day reality. If you think Alaska weather is tough, publishing will make you blanch. But that's an extraordinary story, and again, I think valuable to everybody is. And do we have contacts in the publishing industry? Well, by the time that the first book is done, we do.
Right.
And so very nice. Imani, did we have another minute or two? Do we want to raise any more questions, or are we pretty much rounding out at the end? Thank you for asking this question. The answer was very helpful, says Rajiv. And I agree, that was a nice answer.
All right, I think we're going to round this out.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. It's been fun.
Fantastic.